Through the gloom of the night, Sunday, October 16, 1859, a small band of men tramped silently behind a horse-drawn wagon down a winding Maryland road leading to Harper's Ferry, Virginia. From the shoulder of each man hung loosely a Sharp's rifle, hidden by long gray shawls that protected the ghostly figures against the chilling air of approaching winter. A slight drizzle of rain veiled the towering Blue Ridge Mountains with an eerie mist. Not a sound broke the stillness, save the tramping feet and the creaking wagon. Side by side marched farmer and lawyer, escaped convict, spiritualist, and pious Quaker and ex-slave, joined in common cause by the hatred of slavery. Some had received their baptism of fire in bleeding Kansas, where a bitter 5-year war between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions left death and destruction in its wake and foreshadowed a larger conflict to come. Most were students of guerrilla tactics, all were willing to die to free the slaves. This guerrilla unit was the Provisional Army of the United States, about to launch a fantastic scheme to rid the country of its peculiar institution once and for all. A scheme conjured up by the fierce-eyed, bearded man seated on the wagon, Commander-in-Chief John Brown. He was the planner, the organizer, the driving force, the reason why these men were trudging down this rough Maryland road to an uncertain fate and a date with history. This man who would electrify the nation and bring it closer to civil war by his audacious attack on slavery was born at Torrington, Connecticut, on May 9, 1800, the son of Owen and Ruth Mills Brown. The Browns were a simple, frugal, and hard-working family. They had a deep and abiding faith, and from earliest childhood John Brown was taught the value of strong religious habits. He was required, along with his brothers and sisters, to participate in daily Bible reading and prayer sessions. Fear God and keep His commandments was his father's constant admonition. It was also his father who taught him the evils of slavery. John quit school and went to work at his father's tannery. Owen Brown had already taught his son the art of dressing leather, and John soon displayed remarkable ability in the trade. When the War of 1812 broke out, Owen contracted to supply beef to the American forces in Michigan. He gave John the task of rounding up wild steers and other cattle in the woods and then driving them to army posts more than 100 miles away. It was here that John saw the evils of slavery firsthand. He had just completed one of his cattle drives and was staying with a very gentlemanly landlord who owned a slave about the same age as John.
The Negro boy was badly clothed, poorly fed, and beaten before my eyes with iron shovels or any other thing that came first to hand. It was then I swore eternal war with slavery and became a most determined abolitionist.
When he was 20 years old, Brown married Diane Lusk, a remarkably plain and pious girl a year younger than himself. She died 12 years later following the birth of their 7th child. Brown remarried within a year, and fathered 13 children by his second wife, Mary Ann Day. To feed and clothe his growing family, Brown worked at tanning, surveying, and farming. At times he was shepherd, cattleman, wool merchant, and postmaster. For a while he bred race horses and speculated in real estate. Uniformly unsuccessful in these ventures, Brown's debts mounted, and he was barely able to keep his large family from starvation.
The cattle business has succeeded about as I expected, but I am now somewhat in fear that I shall fail in getting the money I expected on the loan. Should that be the will of Providence, I know of no other way, but we must consider ourselves very poor, for our debts must be paid, if paid at a sacrifice.
His first opportunity to strike a blow at the institution he hated so much came in Kansas, where, following the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, pro-slavery border ruffians clashed brutally with anti-slavery jayhawkers over the extension of slavery to Kansas and Nebraska territories. A violent battle between pro-slave and free soil factions for control of the Kansas territory followed. Atrocity followed atrocity. For the next several years, murders, bushwhackings, lynchings, and burnings were common occurrences, and the territory was aptly named Bleeding Kansas. 5 of Brown's sons, Owen, Jason, Frederick, Salmon, and John Jr., had emigrated to Kansas and joined the Free Soil cause. When they appealed to their father for help in May 1855, Brown, another son Oliver, and son-in-law Henry Thompson rushed to Kansas and plunged into the conflict with a fury. As captain of the Liberty Guards, a quasi-militia company that he himself formed, Brown shortly gained national notoriety as a bold and ruthless leader. However, A different part of John Brown emerged, one that was ordained by God to eradicate slavery and its supporters by any means necessary. Instead of treasuring in his heart a patriotic desire to win freedom for Kansas by peaceable means, he had assumed a hostile attitude toward his enemy. John Brown now desired, not peace, but war. When pro-slavery forces sacked and burned the town of Lawrence in May 1856, Brown was outraged. Proclaiming himself an instrument of God's will, he, with 4 of his sons and 3 others, took revenge by deliberately and brutally murdering 5 pro-slavery men along the banks of Pottawatomie Creek. The plan provided for the theft of a large number of horses from farms nearby. To make the theft possible, and personally safe, they planned to quietly assassinate the owners of the horses. To avoid identification and to dispose of the horses which they intended to steal, they planned to deliver them to Confederates, who would run them out of the neighborhood. While at the same time, they were to receive from such Confederates horses of a more desirable character. Fast-running horses which were to be brought from the northern part of the territory to a designated rendezvous. The horses were duly stolen by Brown and his band. The unfortunate victims, in holding up their arms in vain attempts to shield their heads from impending blows, were struck upon their forearms and hands with small, sharp swords. These in some instances were almost severed from their bodies. The heads of the murdered men, except in the case of John Doyle, were split open and their bodies otherwise mutilated. In the case of Doyle, he was shot in the head. In addition, a sword was run through his breast. He was the first victim of the tragedy. The shot which struck him was the only shot that was fired in these murders, and the firing of it stands charge to John Brown himself. Salmon Brown would never positively state that his father fired it, but admitted that no one else pulled a trigger. James Townsley, one of the participants, confessed the details of the slaughter years later.
We crossed Mosquito Creek, above the residence of the Doyles. The old man Doyle and 2 sons were called out and marched toward Dutch Henry's, where a halt was made. Old John Brown drew a revolver and shot the old man Doyle in the forehead, and Brown's 2 youngest sons immediately fell upon the younger Doyles with their short 2-edged swords. One of the young Doyles was stricken down in an instant, but the other attempted to escape, and was pursued short distance by his assailant and cut down. The company then proceeded down Mosquito Creek to the house of Allen Wilkinson. Wilkinson was taken and marched some distance south of his house and slain in the road, with a short sword, by one of the younger Browns. After he was killed, his body was dragged out to one side and left. We then came to the house of Henry Sherman, generally known as Dutch Henry. Here John Brown and the party went into the house and brought out William Sherman, Dutch Henry's brother, marched him down into the Pottawatomie Creek, where he was slain with swords, by Brown's 2 youngest sons, and left lying in the creek.
In the months that followed, Brown terrorized the Missouri-Kansas border by a series of bloody guerrilla attacks that brought him to the attention of the nation's abolitionist faction. About a month after the Pottawatomie massacre, Brown and his men clashed inconclusively with pro-slavery Missourians at the small settlement of Osawatomie, with both sides retreating, battered and bloody. Prior to the battle, Brown's son Frederick was killed by the Reverend Martin White, who was with the patrol that was scouting the head of the Free Soil Force as it approached Osawatomie. Frederick had come from Lawrence the day before with a compatriot. The 2 stopped overnight at a cabin where they had left their horses. Frederick arose early to feed them, and noticing 2 or 3 mounted men approaching, walked out to see who they were. The minister knew him, and recognized him as being one of a party that had raided his home, and his stables, on the night of August 13th.
Early in the morning of the 30th of August, the enemy's scouts approached to within 1.5 miles of the western boundary of the town of Osawatomie. At this place my son Frederick had lodged with some 4 other young men from Lawrence, and a young man named Garrison. The scouts, led by a pro-slavery preacher named White, shot my son dead in the road, while he, as I have since ascertained, supposed them to be friendly. At the same time they butchered Mr. Garrison, and badly mangled one of the young men from Lawrence, leaving him for dead. Old preacher White, I hear, boasts of having killed my son.
To equip, maintain, and transport the men needed to carry out his Harper's Ferry plan, Brown required a considerable amount of money and weapons. He had neither, but because of his Kansas activities, he was able to enlist the support of Northern abolitionists in his fight against slavery. Chief among Brown's backers was a secret committee of 6, Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe, educator, minister, and reformer; Thomas Wentworth Higginson, militant clergyman of Worcester; Theodore Parker, Boston's outstanding Unitarian minister; Franklin B. Sanborn, editor and schoolmaster of Concord; Gerrit Smith, former New York congressman; and George L. Stearns, industrialist and merchant of Medford. Through them Brown received most of the money and weapons that enabled him to launch his attack. It will never be known how much money Brown actually secured during this raid through the East. The money value of the clothing and war material given to him was about $13,000. In addition to this, Stearns gave him a cash credit of $7,000 against which he could draw from time to time as it might be needed to subsist his company after they entered upon active service. He also had to his credit with the National Kansas Committee the $5,500 it had voted him. Thus his total collections and subscriptions amounted to about $30,000. A valuable asset in his collection of arms was 200 revolvers, which the Massachusetts Arms Company, at Chicopee Falls, agreed to sell to him for $1,300, 50% of the regular price. Brown notified Stearns of the offer, who promptly placed the order, agreeing to pay for the arms by his personal note, in 4 months from date of delivery. The committee also voted him a credit of $500 for expenses. After this trip to New England to raise funds, Brown called a constitutional convention at Chatham, Ontario, Canada, where he produced a copy of the Provisional Constitution. The articles were read and adopted unanimously. Each of the more than 50 people, black and white, signed the Constitution, and swore allegiance to the provisional government. Article 1 of the Constitution provides for qualification of membership, and includes all persons of mature age, whether proscribed, oppressed, and enslaved citizens, or of proscribed and oppressed races of the United States, who shall agree to sustain and enforce the provisional Constitution and ordinances of organization, together with all minor children of such persons, shall be held to be fully entitled to protection under the same. Article 36 is especially instructive. It reads as follows: the entire personal and real property of all persons known to be acting, either directly or indirectly, with or for the enemy, or found in arms with them, or found willfully holding slaves, shall be confiscated and taken whenever and wherever it may be found, in either free or slave states. At the same time, Brown was recruiting his force for the projected assault at Harper's Ferry. Among the first to join him were 3 young veterans of the Kansas fighting, John E. Cook, Aaron D. Stevens, and John H. Coggy. Cook, 27-year-old member of a wealthy Connecticut family, had attended Yale University and studied law in New York City before going to Kansas in 1855. Brown's son Salmon, who knew Cook in Ohio and Kansas, characterized him as highly erratic in temperament and not overly stocked with morality. Stevens, then 26 years old, was also a native of Connecticut. He ran away from home at the age of 16 and joined the Massachusetts Volunteer Regiment to fight in the Mexican War. Honorably discharged at the end of that conflict, he found civilian life so boring that he enlisted as a bugler in a United States Dragoon Regiment in the West and took part in several campaigns against the Navajo and Apache Indians. Coggy, an Ohio man of 22, was largely self-educated and had taught school in Virginia until his abolitionist views got him into trouble with local officials and he fled to Kansas. In January 1857 he was shot by a pro-slavery judge during a disagreement and was still suffering from his wounds when he joined. He was articulate and highly intelligent, of serene temperament, and not easily aroused. When he enlisted them, Brown told Cook, Stevens, and Coggy only that he was organizing a company of men to resist pro-slavery aggressions. He did not tell them where he planned to take them. When 7 more volunteers joined the group, the men finally learned that Harper's Ferry was the probable target. In the summer of 1859, Harper's Ferry was a quietly thriving little industrial and transportation community sitting on a narrow shelf of land at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers in the Blue Ridge Mountains of northern Virginia. The land on which the town sat was first settled in 1733 by a Pennsylvania Dutchman named Peter Stevens, who operated a small ferryboat service across the rivers. When Robert Harper bought the land in 1747, he improved the ferry service and built a grist mill. Around these facilities at the base of Bolivar Heights, the village of Harper's Ferry gradually developed. In 1794, President George Washington established an armory at Harper's Ferry due to its abundant resources. Abundant water power was available, iron ore was plentiful nearby, hardwood forests ensured a steady supply of charcoal to fuel the forges, and the place was far enough inland to be secure from foreign invasion. The first muskets were completed in 1801. In 1803 production was expanded to include rifles, and 2 years later the manufacture of pistols. By 1810 the armory was turning out 10,000 firearms annually, storing them in 2 arsenal buildings nearby on Shenandoah Street. Besides the rifle factories on Hall Island, Virginius Island boasted an iron foundry, flour mill, cotton mill, and machine shop, all powered by water diverted through a dam in the Shenandoah River and a series of sluiceways and underground water tunnels. The armory by 1859 had spread to include 20 workshops and offices, lined in a neat double row over an area 600 yards long. At its peak, the armory provided employment for more than 400 men. With the expansion of industry and the development of superior transportation facilities, the population of the community swelled to nearly 3,000 by 1859. The total number of slaves in the entire 6-county area around Harper's Ferry was just slightly more than 18,000, of which less than 5,000 were men. There were no large plantations because the land and the climate could not sustain a plantation economy. John Brown arrived amidst this prosperity on July 3, 1859. Not yet 60 years old, the rigors of frontier living had nevertheless left their imprint upon him, and there were those who said he looked and walked more than ever like an old man. With Brown were 2 of his sons, 34-year-old Owen and 20-year-old Oliver, and Kansas veteran Jeremiah G. Anderson. The 26-year-old, Indiana-born Anderson was the grandson of Southern slaveholders and had joined the abolitionist cause in 1857 after working several unproductive years as a peddler, farmer, and sawyer. Determined to eliminate slavery, Anderson once vowed to make this land of liberty and equality shake to the center. Brown began exploring the Maryland side of the Potomac to find a suitable hideout for his raiders. Local inquiry led him to a farm owned by the heirs of a Dr. Kennedy about 5 miles north of Harper's Ferry. The farm was remote from other settlements, and it was surrounded by woods and hidden by undergrowth. An ideal situation for hiding men and supplies from the gaze of inquisitive neighbors. His base established, Brown laid plans to assemble his arms and supplies and to gather in his followers. Alone and in 2s and 3s, Brown's followers began to assemble at the farm. Watson Brown arrived on August 6. Tall and rather fair, with finely knit frame, athletic and active, the 24-year-old Watson brought with him 2 of his brothers-in-law and North Elba neighbors, William and Dauphin Thompson. The Thompsons had not previously taken active roles in the anti-slavery movement, but they were dedicated abolitionists. William, 26 years old, was fun-loving and good-natured. His 20-year-old brother Dauphin had never been away from home before. Both had come to the Kennedy farm because they were firmly convinced of the justness of John Brown's cause. Next came Aaron Stevens and Charles Plummet Tidd. Tidd was a Kansas veteran. He was quick-tempered, but according to Annie Brown, his rages soon passed and then he tried all he could to repair damages. Tidd and Stevens were followed by 22-year-old Albert Hazlitt, another veteran of the Kansas fighting, Canadian-born Stuart Taylor, and 2 brothers from Iowa, Edwin, and Barclay Coppock. Hazlitt had worked on his brother's farm in western Pennsylvania before joining Brown at the Kennedy farm. He was totally committed to the overthrow of slavery. The Coppocks were Quakers by birth and training. They were in Kansas during the Troubles there but took no part in the fighting. Edwin, at 24, was 4 years older than his brother Barclay. Both had joined Brown initially in 1858 at Springdale, Iowa, where they were living with their mother, shortly before the Chatham Convention. 20-year-old William H. Lehman arrived near the end of August. He went to Kansas in 1856 where he served in Brown's Liberty Guards militia company. Impulsive, hard to control, the 6-foot-tall Lehman smoked a good deal and drank sometimes, but he had a good intellect with great ingenuity. After Lehman came Dangerfield Newby, a mulatto born a slave but freed by his Scotch father, and Osborne P. Anderson, a 33-year-old free Negro who had worked as a printer before joining Brown in Canada in 1858. Newby, at 44 the oldest of the group save for Brown himself, had a wife and several children in bondage in the South. He came to the Kennedy farmhouse convinced that the only way to free them was with rifle and bullet. He carried with him a letter from his wife in which she begged him to buy me and the baby, that has just commenced to crawl, as soon as possible, for if you do not get me somebody else will. Emperor Shields Green, a 23-year-old illiterate escaped slave from Charleston, South Carolina joined up at Chambersburg where Brown had gone in mid-August to enlist the aid of the famed abolitionist, orator, and journalist, Frederick Douglass. When the black leader learned the details of the planned assault on Harper's Ferry, he refused to participate, arguing that an attack on the government would array the whole country against him and antagonize the very people to whom the abolitionists looked for support. Moreover, Douglass believed that the plan could not succeed, that Brown was going into a perfect steel trap, and that once in he would never get out alive. Before leaving, Douglass asked Shields Green, who had accompanied him to the meeting, what he intended to do. Green replied simply, "I believe I will go with the old man." Finally, on October 15, with the arrival of 22-year-old Francis J. Merriam and two Ohio blacks, John Copeland and Lewis S. Leary, both 25, the ranks of the Provisional Army of the United States were completed. In all there were 21 men besides the commander-in-chief. Of these, 19 were under 30, 3 not yet 21. Life at the Kennedy farm was wearing and tedious. Brown's most trying task was to keep his slowly increasing force occupied and out of sight. Brown's chief fear was that neighbors would become suspicious and possibly uncover his revolutionary plans. Reasoning that nearby families would be less distrustful with women among the group, he appealed to his wife and daughter Annie at their home in North Elba, New York, to come live with him. Mrs. Brown was unable to make the long journey, but Annie and Oliver's wife Martha did join him in mid-July. Their presence proved of inestimable value not only in alleviating suspicion but in contributing to the morale of the men. Martha served as cook and housekeeper, preparing meals on a wood stove in the upstairs living room. Annie kept constant watch for prying neighbors. As September ended and the time for the attack approached, Annie and Martha were sent back to North Elba. Brown and his men busied themselves overhauling the rifles and pistols and attaching pike heads to shafts. The pikes were Brown's own idea. Knowing that most of the slaves he expected to join him were unskilled in the use of firearms, he decided they could handle a pike. 1,000 men armed with pikes and backed by Brown's more experienced soldiers could constitute a formidable army. October arrived. Still Brown delayed, hoping that more men would come. Many upon whom he had counted failed to join him for a variety of reasons. Even two of his sons, Jason and Salmon, refused to participate. John Jr. had become mentally unstable after the Pottawatomie massacre even though he did not take part. He was in no condition to report to Harper's Ferry. Brown could wait no longer. Calling his men together, he announced that the attack would take place the next night. The daylight hours of Sunday, October 16, 1859, were quiet ones at the Kennedy farm. Early in the morning John Brown held worship services, the impending attack invoking deep solemnity upon the gathering. After breakfast and roll call a final meeting was held and instructions were given. Then everything was in readiness. About 8 p.m., Brown turned to his followers. "Men," he said, "get on your arms, we will proceed to the ferry." The men, ready for hours, slung their Sharps rifles over their shoulders, concealing them under long, gray shawls that served as overcoats, and waited for the order to march. Owen Brown, Barclay Coppock, and Miriam were detailed to remain at the farm as a rearguard. In the morning they were to bring the rest of the weapons nearer the town where they could be passed out to the slave army Brown expected to raise. Tidd and Cook, who were best acquainted with the route, preceded the main body as scouts, cutting telegraph wires along the sides of both rivers. Harper's Ferry was cut off from the rest of the world. For more than 2 hours the men tramped along behind the wagon, strictly adhering to Brown's order to maintain silence. About 10:30 p.m., they reached the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad bridge that would carry them into Harper's Ferry. It was a long wooden-covered structure that spanned the Potomac River a little upstream from where the Shenandoah comes spilling in from the south. Coggy and Stevens entered first and encountered watchman William Williams, who approached with a lantern. They quickly took Williams prisoner. The rest of the raiders, except for Watson Brown and Stuart Taylor, who were told to stay on the Maryland side as a rear guard, fastened cartridge boxes to the outside of their clothing for ready access and followed the wagon onto the bridge. Crossing quickly, the raiders stepped from the tunnel's black throat into the slumbering town. Before them lay a large structure that doubled as the railroad depot and the wager house. Just beyond were the U.S. Arsenal buildings where thousands of guns were stored. To the right the armory shops stretched in a double row along the Potomac. Brown turned the horse and wagon toward the armory. Daniel Whelan, the armory's night watchman, heard the wagon coming down the street from the depot. Thinking it was the head watchman, he came out from his station in the fire engine house that doubled as a guard post just inside the armory grounds to find several rifles pointed at him. To his prisoners, Whelan and Williams, Brown announced his purpose.
I came here from Kansas, and this is a slave state. I want to free all the Negroes in this state. I have possession now of the United States Armory, and if the citizens interfere with me, I must only burn the town and have blood.